Melee infantry is supposed to be the backbone of most armies, but in Warhammer 3, it often feels like the worst investment you can make. It gets shot before reaching combat, deleted by magic, or kited across the map, and sometimes half of the unit is not even attacking. So why does this happen? And more importantly, when is melee infantry actually good? Melee infantry has two built-in limitations. First, it only matters once it reaches melee range, and second, infantry is usually slow, which means it often cannot control engagements. And this becomes a huge problem because battles are no longer dominated by infantry formations. Melee infantry is fighting against artillery and guns, magic and monsters, flyers, heroes. The exact same reason tightly packed infantry disappeared from real warfare also exists in Warhammer battles. If one side is slowly advancing in formation, while the other is dropping artillery shells and vortexes, the problem becomes obvious very quickly. So the real question is not whether melee infantry can work, it's what actually makes it worth using. Against almost any army with ranged attacks, melee infantry will take damage before it can contribute anything in return, and every casualty taken on the approach directly lowers the amount of damage it can deal once melee starts. Unlike single-entity monsters, infantry loses combat power with casualties. A dragon at 20% health can still be healed back to full. Infantry, except undead, cannot, and every model killed is less total damage output in the battle. To make things more difficult, tightly packed infantry formations are perfect targets for area damage. But even if they somehow avoid heavy casualties, they will still lose vigor, which lowers combat stats. Some units will break under fire, others will survive but reach frontline exhausted, damaged, and far weaker than their unit card suggests. And all of these problems come from the same underlying issue: short engagement range. To influence the battle, melee infantry must physically reach the enemy, which means it must cross the battlefield under pressure. And once they finally reach combat, another problem appears. Most melee infantry units are not particularly efficient damage dealers. The problem is simple: only the frontline models can actually attack. Compare this to missile units, where almost every model can do damage at the same time. This is one of the main reasons missile units usually generate more kills and value over the course of battle. Another problem arises in balanced armies. Even if you use melee infantry purely as line holders for ranged units, they will often block line of sight, but also take large amounts of friendly fire. Artillery is especially dangerous for your own troops, but even the basic archers can inflict huge amount of friendly fire by shooting into their back. So melee infantry struggles because it has structural weaknesses other unit types simply do not have, but it also has a unique role it can play. In general, line holding can be difficult in combination with range-heavy armies. However, it can still be done, as long as you do not position infantry in front of missiles. There are multiple formations you can use in which melee infantry can have significant role. I covered some of them in my gunpowder formations video, the link is in description. As line holders, biggest advantage of melee infantry is space they can cover, plugging any possible gaps enemies could exploit, as well as using deep formations which provide more stopping power against charges. Even with low damage output, tanky melee infantry can still create value by protecting vulnerable units, absorbing pressure, and buying time for stronger damage dealers. However, there is one damage source in Warhammer 3 that has extremely strong synergy with melee infantry, and that is magic. Unlike artillery, most spells can be controlled very precisely. You can place them exactly where you want, and this includes bombardments, stationary vortexes, and especially wind spells. The most iconic example is Vampire Count's infantry combined with Wind of Death. But many other lords of magic have access to similar combinations, like Fiery Convocation from Lore of High Magic or Penumbral Pendulum from Lore of Shadows. The reason wind spells work so well with melee infantry is because you can force the shape of front into a straight line, and this allows wind spells to hit huge numbers of models. You can absolutely use these same spells with single entities, but the damage efficiency per cast is usually lower because fewer models get hit. So while artillery often struggles with friendly fire, with magic you can completely avoid this issue. Melee infantry becomes much stronger when it bypasses its normal weaknesses or gains specialized advantages against enemy units. For this, a unit usually needs some special attribute, ability or mechanic that removes at least one of the problems mentioned earlier. For example, Stalk immediately removes one of the biggest infantry weaknesses, taking damage on the approach, so it can preserve combat effectiveness before melee starts. Instead of fighting a half-dead infantry, the enemy suddenly has to deal with full health unit appearing at close range. But it also improves engagement control. Instead of walking across the battlefield under constant missile fire, stalking infantry can choose when and where to engage. High resistances can also drastically improve survivability and performance. Physical resistance, missile resistance, or ward save all reduce some of the incoming damage. But it also improves synergy with ranged units, because now they can absorb more friendly fire. The less damage infantry takes from its own backline, the longer it can hold, and the more efficiently the army functions overall. Other abilities can improve combat effectiveness in different ways. Perfect Vigor prevents stat degradation over time. Strider removes terrain penalties. Vanguard deployment indirectly improves survivability by reducing exposure time, and so on. All of these tools help melee infantry bypass at least part of its normal limitations, and this is usually why specialized infantry performs significantly better than generic one. The more unique advantages a unit has, the more effectively it can compensate for the structural weaknesses of melee combat itself. Another factor that can greatly improve melee infantry performance is overwhelming stat superiority. This is when it massively outscales the average enemy units. In campaign, this usually happens when you recruit units far stronger than what the AI can field at that moment. But some units naturally outperform other factions at the same recruitment tier. A good example are Bloodletters of Khorne. For a tier 1 infantry unit, Bloodletters have extremely high offensive potential. If you compare them to what most factions recruit early on, like Goblins, it becomes very obvious why they dominate early campaigns so consistently. Against the average units present between turn 1 and 20, Bloodletters effectively behave like a much higher tier unit. And once melee infantry gains overwhelming stat superiority, many of its weaknesses become less important. A unit with extremely high melee attack or weapon strength can still generate massive value even after taking casualties on the approach. This is not unique to infantry specifically, as melee damage dealers often scale harder with more stats, which compensates for lack of range. Frenzy, anti-infantry and anti-large bonuses, and various lords buffs can all create situations where melee infantry massively outperforms enemy units. But this advantage becomes less reliable later in campaigns. As the campaign progresses, enemy units also gain stronger stats, buffs, ranks. At that point, other unit types start gaining the same offensive power while still keeping their own advantages like speed, missiles, or special attributes. And this is usually where many melee infantry units start falling off. The longer a campaign continues, the harder it becomes for raw stats alone to overcome the problems of melee infantry. Still, some factions can push infantry stats so high that the units remain effective even in late game. Good examples are Norscan Berserkers or the new Tiger Warriors. With enough buffs, these units can reach extremely high melee attack values and deal enough damage to threaten even elite monsters. And once infantry reaches this level of offensive power, even damaged units can still generate huge value after heavy casualties. So in extreme cases, raw stats can overcome usual weaknesses. The final factor that can make melee infantry effective is overwhelming numbers. Some factions can recruit huge amounts of cheap infantry and use them aggressively without worrying too much about casualties. This approach is not always cost effective, but under the right conditions it can still work well. For some factions, this is the best way to deal with powerful lords and heroes in early game, like Angrim or Grimgor. These lords hit extremely hard, but they only kill a handful of models per hit. If you dogpile thousands of cheap infantry, eventually they will overwhelm them. Same applies to usual battles. 2 or 3 stacks of clanrats with spears in a blob will become impenetrable wall for even Bretonnian knights. Greenskin nasty skulkers are another good example. They cannot reliably beat elite infantry, but if you throw in 2 or 3 stacks of these cheap armor-piercing goblins, you can beat even the toughest dwarf armies. If you can afford to throw enough bodies at the enemy, eventually you will win. But it comes down to the cost. It can work with some factions like Skaven or vampires, but for others it's way too expensive trade. It's also important to note that overwhelming numbers alone are not always enough, but when combined with specific tools like anti-large or armor-piercing, mass infantry can still become effective. Melee infantry, even with all of its structural weaknesses, is still most common unit type you will encounter in campaigns, and even if you do not use it in huge numbers, it's still worth knowing how to get maximum out of it in specific scenarios. But other unit types also have their own issues in Warhammer 3, like the cavalry, which can fail to execute even the basic tactics like hammer and anvil, and more about it in this video. See ya.